The void between stars is not empty, it breathes. That was the first thing Dr. Mara Voss had written in her field journal when the Kepler array picked up the signal. 3 years before the world knew anything was out there. 4 years before the United Earth Defense Compact was formed in secret. And 6 years before the night the lights started going out. She had been 31 then, running on bad coffee, and the particular madness that grips astronomers who spend too long staring at things that should not be there. The signal had come in at 3:47 in the morning, a Tuesday, which she had always thought was an absurd day for first contact. Not a Friday, not the dramatic stroke of midnight on some historically significant date. A Tuesday in October, when the heating unit in the Kepler array's main observation bay had broken down, and she was wearing 2 sweaters and a scarf indoors, and the coffee had gone cold before she even poured it. The signal was not a greeting. It was not a mathematical sequence designed to demonstrate intelligence, not prime numbers arranged in a clever pattern, not the kind of thing science fiction writers had imagined for a century. It was a declaration. Mara had not known that at the time, of course. The translation had taken 8 months, and the full resources of a linguistics team, a quantum computing cluster, and one extraordinarily disagreeable mathematician named Ptolemy Hatch, who had never once in his life said good morning to anyone, but had cracked the base syntax of the signal in 6 days, and then gone back to being disagreeable. The declaration, once fully translated, read as follows. This sector of space has been catalogued under Hegemony Resource Survey 7441. Indigenous biological presence noted. Classification, dormant. No further monitoring required. They had catalogued humanity, filed them under dormant, decided they were not worth watching. Mara had stared at that translation for a long time. Then she had walked down the hall to the office of General Carver Webb, who had been assigned to the Kepler Array project by the Joint Chiefs after the signal's existence leaked to 3 members of Congress, and she had placed the printout on his desk without saying anything. Webb had read it twice. He was a large man, the kind of large that came from decades of military discipline rather than genetics, with a face that had been trained out of showing surprise. He showed surprise now. Then something else moved behind his eyes, something slower and more dangerous, and he had picked up his phone and made a call that lasted 40 minutes and resulted, eventually, in everything that followed. Humanity had been classified as dormant. They decided to stay that way. Not because they were afraid. Mara would spend years later trying to explain this to people who assumed the silence was cowardice, and she never quite found the right words for it, but the truth was simpler and stranger than fear. Humanity looked at that declaration, at the casual, bureaucratic certainty of it, at the fact that something out there had swept its instruments across an entire planet teeming with 8 billion minds, and filed them under a category that essentially meant not interesting enough to bother with, and felt something old wake up in the collective gut of the species. Something that had survived ice ages and plagues and the specific civilizational madness of the 20th century. Something that knew, instinctively, the difference between being overlooked and being underestimated, and understood with bone-deep clarity which of those 2 things was the greater advantage. They stayed quiet, they got to work. The compact was 17 nations initially, then 30, then all of them, unified not by ideology or economics or any of the things that had always fractured humanity before, but by the simple shared understanding that something was out there, and it had looked at them and seen nothing worth worrying about. The military buildup was conducted entirely underground, literally and figuratively. The physics research that should have taken 200 years got compressed into 12, because when every major institution on the planet quietly redirects a third of its computational resources toward a single problem, things move faster than anyone thought possible. Dr. Chen Yi-wan, who was 26 and had never intended to work in weapons development, solved the quantum entanglement propulsion problem in her 3rd year at the Compact's underground research facility in the New Mexico desert. Working from first principles, she had derived herself, because the existing literature did not go far enough. She had cried afterward, not from pride but from the particular exhaustion of someone who has held a weight too long and finally been allowed to set it down. They built in silence. They launched in silence. The first fleet of 87 vessels left the solar system without a single transmission, running dark, engines operating on a frequency spectrum that their own survey had confirmed the hegemony's instruments did not monitor. It was the single largest military operation in human history, and it produced no detectable signal whatsoever. Mara, watching the launch feeds in the compact's command center deep beneath what had once been Colorado, thought about Tuesday mornings and cold coffee, and the specific arrogance of something that looks at a living world and writes dormant and moves on. She thought, we have been waiting a very long time for something worth getting up for. The first star went dark 14 months after the fleet's departure. It was not a star anyone had named. It was a catalog number, a dim red dwarf at the edge of the hegemony's inner territory, the kind of star that hosted cold rocks and nothing else, notable only because it was the site of one of the hegemony's 17 deep space refueling stations. The hegemony's monitoring systems registered its disappearance as an anomaly and flagged it for review. Review was scheduled for the following administrative cycle, which occurred every 43 standard days. By the time the review cycle came around, 4 more stars had gone dark. Not gone, that was the thing that would eventually send the hegemony's analysts into a spiral of increasingly desperate recalculation. The stars had not died. The light was simply being blocked. Something vast and precisely positioned was sitting between those stars and the hegemony's sensors, absorbing or redirecting every photon that should have carried information back to their arrays. The humans had not destroyed anything. They had hidden it. They had looked at the hegemony's sensor architecture, the design of which the Compact's intelligence division had spent 4 years reverse engineering from the original signals carrier wave. And they had placed their ships and their arrays and their newly constructed platforms exactly where the gaps were. The hegemony could not see what was happening because the humans had learned to stand in their blind spots. Admiral Reyes Domingo had commanded the 4th wing of the human fleet, 60 vessels spread across a region of space roughly equivalent to the distance between Earth and Alpha Centauri, each one running dark, each one in constant quantum-entangled communication with the others. He was 54 years old, had grown up in New Mexico 30 miles from the facility where Chen Yiwen would later cry over her propulsion calculations, had joined the old American military at 19 and transferred to the Compact at 41 when the recruitment came, and he had read the briefing documents and felt the same thing Mara Voss had felt 6 years earlier. Something old waking up. Something that did not panic and did not bluster and simply began calculating odds. The odds, he had noted at the time, were not as bad as you might think. The hegemony was vast, yes. It spanned 412 star systems, contained within it something like 60,000 distinct species in various states of incorporation, operated on a military-industrial scale that made humanity's most ambitious projections look like a child's drawing. Its ships were enormous, its weapons sophisticated, its response protocols refined over 60,000 years of expanding through the galaxy and absorbing or eliminating whatever it found. It had not faced a serious military challenge in 11,000 years. Its strategic thinking had calcified accordingly. When you have not been surprised in 11 millennia, surprise becomes theoretically possible but practically unimaginable, and the gap between those two things is exactly where Domingo's fleet was currently positioned. He watched the tactical display in his command chair and felt something he had not expected to feel this far from home: calm. Not the performed calm of a commander managing his crew's nerves, but genuine stillness. The particular quiet of a person who has done the preparation and knows the preparation was sufficient, and is now simply waiting for the moment to arrive. The moment arrived at 400 ship time, which was Tuesday. Of course it was Tuesday. The hegemony's response fleet had taken 11 standard days to mobilize after the disappearance of the refueling stations, which was faster than the compact's analysts had projected and slower than the compact's engineers had prepared for. 430 hegemony vessels in tight formation, the kind of formation that worked extremely well against every enemy the hegemony had ever encountered, which was to say enemies who either massed their forces for direct engagement or scattered and ran. The formation was optimized for two scenarios. The humans were doing neither. Domingo said, "All wings execute Phase 2. The first thing the hegemony fleet saw on every sensor frequency simultaneously was nothing. Then, in the space of 0.4 seconds, they saw everything. 87 human ships dropped their stealth profiles at precisely the same instant, not ahead of the hegemony formation, not behind it, but through it, distributed in a three-dimensional pattern that had been calculated specifically to position every human vessel within the minimum engagement range of at least 3 hegemony ships, while simultaneously being outside the optimal firing arcs of all of them. The hegemony's battle formation was predicated on the assumption that an enemy fleet would be in front of them. The humans were already inside. The engagement lasted 6 minutes and 41 seconds. The hegemony lost 217 vessels. The humans lost 4. Domingo spent the last 2 minutes of the engagement watching his tactical display with the same stillness he had felt at the beginning and thought about the mechanics of it, the pure, cold, applied geometry of what had just happened, and felt not triumph but something quieter, something that was almost grief, because 217 ships meant crews, meant living things that had not known until too late what they were dealing with. Meant the moment when the hegemony's 11,000-year-old certainty about the shape of the universe had broken open, and something new and terrible had fallen through the gap. He had not wanted this. None of them had wanted this. They had wanted to be left alone on their small, warm planet with their cold coffee and their Tuesday mornings, and their extraordinary, ridiculous, impractical project of being human. The hegemony had decided that was not interesting enough to bother with, and here they were, 6 minutes and 41 seconds into the realignment of galactic power. The survivors ran. Domingo let them run. That was part of the plan, too. The news reached the hegemony's Central Administrative World 19 standard days later. Mara Voss was in the Compact's command center when the interception team decoded the hegemony's internal communications traffic and put the translation on the main screen. She read it 3 times. Then she started to laugh, quietly at first and then less quietly, until the communications officer at the next station turned to look at her with an expression of professional concern. The hegemony's Admiralty Board had classified the engagement as an anomaly. They had requested additional data. They had formed a committee. They still did not understand what they were dealing with. They had filed humanity under dormant and moved on and never updated the file, and now their best fleet had been taken apart by a species they had dismissed without a second look, and their response was to form a committee. Mara thought about the signal that had come in on a Tuesday morning 6 years ago, the casual certainty of it. This sector of space has been catalogued. Indigenous biological presence noted. Classification, dormant. She thought, "You have no idea how long we have been waiting." The committee's report, when it finally circulated through hegemony administrative channels, was thorough by the standards of a bureaucracy that had not been seriously challenged in 11,000 years, which was to say it was thorough in exactly the wrong ways. It examined the tactical details of the engagement, noted the unusual deployment pattern, recommended updates to standard formation doctrine, and suggested a larger follow-up force of approximately 900 vessels to address the anomalous contact. It did not ask the question that mattered, which was, how long have they been preparing, and what else have they built that we have not seen? That question had an answer. The committee simply did not know to ask it. While the First Fleet had been moving into position in the outer territories, the Second and Third Fleets had been doing something else entirely. They had been mapping every dark current between star systems, every region of space that the hegemony survey network checked irregularly or not at all, every logistical node that the hegemony's supply chain depended on but did not heavily monitor, all of it mapped, cataloged, analyzed. Commander Yuki Adami, who commanded the Third Fleet and had a doctorate in network theory that she had completed before the Compact recruited her, had spent 3 years building a model of the hegemony's supply architecture. It was not the kind of model that identified military targets. It was the kind of model that identified the 17 specific points in a network of 412 star systems, where a disruption would cascade through the entire system like a fault line, slow and certain, and ultimately total. She had briefed the Compact's Strategic Council on her findings 14 months before the first engagement. The Council had looked at her model for a long time. Then the senior member, a former Brazilian diplomat named Augusto Ferreira, who was 68 years old and had spent his career negotiating agreements that nobody quite honored, had asked her, "If we do this, is there a version where it ends without total war?" Adami had said, "Yes, but only if they figure out what's happening before we have to show them the rest of it." Ferreira had said, "And if they form a committee instead?" She had not answered because they both already knew. The 900-vessel fleet that the hegemony dispatched 3 months after the committee's report was the largest single military force the hegemony had deployed in 4,000 years. Its commander was an entity called the Grand Admiral Vethkalos, who had commanded hegemony forces for the equivalent of 230 human years and had never lost an engagement. The fleet moved through hegemony space with the particular confidence of something that had always won, its formation tight, its sensors active, its tactical protocols updated to account for the anomalous deployment pattern that had cost them 217 ships. They had updated their formation doctrine. They had not updated their assumptions. Adami watched the hegemony fleet's approach on the tactical display of her command vessel, a ship called the Persistence, and thought about network theory and the specific ways that systems fail. The hegemony was a system. It had been running without serious perturbation for 60,000 years. Systems like that develop rigidities. They optimize for the problems they have already solved and lose the capacity to imagine problems they have not encountered. The hegemony was not stupid. 60,000 years of successful expansion was not a stupid thing, but it had never had to be truly adaptive, and adaptability was a muscle, and muscles atrophied. Humanity had been running on adaptability since the Pleistocene. It was arguably the only thing they had ever been reliably good at. Phase 3 began. The 900 hegemony vessels arrived at the coordinates where the first engagement had occurred to find nothing. No human ships, no debris, no signal, just empty space and the faint background radiation of the universe going about its business. Vethkalos ordered a sensor sweep. The sweep found nothing. Vethkalos ordered an expanded sweep covering a light-year radius. That sweep also found nothing. What the sweeps did not find, because they were looking outward and the relevant events were happening inward, was that 6 of the hegemony's 17 supply chain nodes had just gone dark. Not destroyed, blocked. The same technique that had been used on the sensor arrays in the outer territories, now applied to the supply network's communication relays. The hegemony fleet at the engagement coordinates was still in communication with its home systems, but 6 of the relay points that moved supplies, fuel, and replacement components from the hegemony's industrial core to its outer territories had gone silent. The humans had not attacked a single hegemony vessel or station. They had simply sat down in the middle of the supply chain and refused to move. Vethkalos received the reports from the supply network 16 minutes after the sensor sweeps came back empty. The Grand Admiral looked at the reports for a very long time. In 230 years of military command, this had not happened before. Enemies attacked. Enemies ran. Enemies negotiated from positions of weakness, or they did not negotiate at all. This enemy had just disrupted the hegemony's logistics network across a front covering 60 star systems without firing a single weapon, and their fleet was sitting somewhere that 900 hegemony vessels and every sensor array in the outer territories could not find them. For the first time in 230 years, Veth Kalos did not know what to do next. The Grand Admiral sent a communication back to the Admiralty Board. The communication described the situation with precision and requested guidance. Guidance came back 11 days later in the form of another committee recommendation, which suggested deploying an additional 1,200 vessels to sweep the affected territories. Veth Kalos read the recommendation and experienced something that, in whatever emotional architecture this species possessed, was probably equivalent to a very long and very tired sigh. The communication from the humans came in on the 23rd day. It arrived on a frequency that the hegemony used only for diplomatic contact, a frequency that no species had successfully used to contact the hegemony without first being formally incorporated into its administrative structure. It arrived in perfect hegemony administrative language, grammatically flawless, the kind of formal register used for communications between equals, which was itself a message. The hegemony did not have equals, or had not until recently. The message was brief. Mara Voss had written it herself, with input from Ferreira and 3 linguists and Ptolemy Hatch, who was still disagreeable but had developed over the years a grudging respect for what they were doing here. It read as follows. You catalogued us as dormant 7 years ago. We have spent those 7 years building what you are currently experiencing. We have the capability to extend this disruption to all 17 supply nodes, and to engage your fleet on terms that we have already demonstrated are not favorable to you. We are not doing those things. We are asking for a conversation. We suggest you have this one before we decide a conversation is no longer the most efficient use of our time. Veth Kalos read the message 4 times. Then the Grand Admiral did something that no hegemony military commander had done in 4,000 years. Without waiting for guidance from the Admiralty Board, without convening a committee, without consulting the administrative protocols that governed every formal military action, Veth Kalos opened a direct response channel and sent 2 words back. We are listening. Ferreira conducted the negotiations himself. He was 68 years old and had spent 4 decades in diplomacy, and he had never sat across a table, metaphorically speaking. The negotiation was conducted via quantum-entangled relay across 40 light-years from anything quite like Veth Kalos, but the fundamental dynamics of negotiation were the same regardless of the species involved. You had leverage or you did not. You had demonstrated capability or you had not. You had established, through your prior actions, whether you were the kind of party that needed to be taken seriously. The compact had spent 7 years establishing exactly that. Veth Kalos, Ferreira found, was more flexible than the Admiralty Board. This was because Veth Kalos had been in the engagement zone and had read the sensor reports personally, and had watched 900 hegemony vessels fail to find a human fleet that had demonstrably been there recently. The Grand Admiral had the direct experience of not knowing, which was a more honest position than the board's continued insistence on treating this as an anomaly to be administratively resolved. The negotiations lasted 41 days. There were moments that nearly collapsed them. On day 17, the Admiralty Board sent Veth Kalos revised instructions that attempted to reframe the negotiation as a surrender proceeding, which Ferreira rejected in language that was diplomatically impeccable and entirely unambiguous. On day 29, a faction within the board attempted to use the delay to position a reserve fleet for what the communications intercepts described as a conclusive engagement, which Chen Yiwan's propulsion network detected, and which Domingo's fleet moved to neutralize without firing a single shot, placing themselves between the reserve fleet and its intended vector in a maneuver that took 40 minutes and communicated everything that needed to be communicated without a word. The reserve fleet stood down. The negotiations continued. On day 41, at 3:47 in the morning, Mara had noticed the time and thought, of course, Tuesday. The agreement was finalized. It was not a surrender. It was not a treaty between conqueror and conquered. It was something the hegemony had not had a template for in 60,000 years of expansion, an agreement between parties who had looked at each other clearly and decided that fighting was the less interesting option. Humanity would not join the hegemony. The hegemony would not approach human space. A boundary was established and acknowledged by both parties. Diplomatic contact channels were opened. Trade was possible if both parties desired it, and nobody was going to desire it immediately, which was fine. What mattered, what Ferreira had spent 41 days making absolutely certain was in the text of the agreement, was the clause that read, "Classification of the human species as dormant is hereby rescinded and replaced with classification. Independent sovereign entity, not to be approached without prior diplomatic contact." They had filed humanity differently. That was the part that had mattered to Mara from the beginning, more than the military capability, more than the leverage, more even than the outcome. Something had looked at her species and seen nothing worth watching, and she had spent 7 years of her life, along with approximately 4 billion other people in various ways, both large and small, in the project of correcting that assessment. She was in the command center when the final confirmation came through. The room was full. It had been full for 41 days, people working in shifts, sleeping in cots in the adjacent corridor, surviving on the kind of institutional coffee that was somehow worse than the cold coffee Mara had been drinking the night the signal arrived. When the confirmation text appeared on the main screen and the communications officer said, quietly, "That's it, that's the final sign-off," the room was silent for a moment in the way that rooms are sometimes silent when something very large has just changed, and the people in the room are still catching up to it. Then Ptolemy Hatch, who was standing in the back of the room because he had never once in his professional life missed a significant moment despite being disagreeable about everything else, said, "Dormant. They really thought we were dormant." Someone laughed, then someone else. Then the room was not silent anymore. Mara sat down in her chair and looked at the final text of the agreement on her screen and thought about the signal that had come in on a Tuesday morning when the heating was broken and her coffee was cold. The casual certainty of it. The way it had swept across an entire living world and found nothing worth noting. She thought about what humanity had done with that dismissal. Not in anger, not in fear, but in the particular cold-eyed patience of a species that had survived everything the planet and each other could throw at them, and had come out the other side with a very clear understanding of what they were capable of when they had a reason to find out. 7 years, 87 ships in the first deployment, 4 casualties in the first engagement, 4 people whose names were already on a monument being built in the Colorado facility, 4 people who had known what they were part of and had gone anyway because that was what the moment had asked for. Chen Yi-1, who had cried from exhaustion over her propulsion calculations and then gone back to refining them. Adami, who had built a network model so precise that she had predicted the exact cascade failure points in a civilization that had never told anyone its infrastructure details. Domingo, who had felt calm at 400 on a Tuesday when the universe was about to change, and had simply said execute phase 2 in the same voice he used to ask for coffee. Ferreira, who was 68 years old and had spent 4 decades in diplomacy, and had just concluded the most important negotiation in human history by being stubborn and precise and utterly unwilling to let them be filed away again. The stars were not dark anymore. That had been a temporary measure, the blocking arrays standing down as part of the agreement's implementation protocol, the light returning to the hegemony's sensors in the same quiet way it had been removed. 6 supply nodes coming back online, 17 relay stations resuming transmission, the hegemony's logistics network reasserting itself like blood returning to a limb. The humans had not destroyed anything. They had simply demonstrated that they could, and then they had put it down. That was the part Mara kept returning to in the weeks and months that followed, as the compact transitioned into something more permanent, and the facilities under Colorado became the headquarters of what would eventually be called the Earth Diplomatic and Strategic Office. as Chen Yiwan started a research division dedicated to the next generation of propulsion theory that was already obsolete by the standards of what she was imagining. As Domingo and Adami were both offered positions that neither of them particularly wanted, but both accepted because the work was not done, and they knew it. The galaxy had mistaken their silence for absence. It had looked at a world full of 8 billion people building and dreaming and fighting and loving, and doing the 10,000 complicated things that constituted being human, and it had concluded there was nothing there worth watching. And humanity had looked back at that assessment and had not raged against it, had not transmitted desperate proof of their existence and intelligence, had not tried to make themselves seen, had simply become worth worrying about. Mara wrote that in her field journal on the day the final confirmation came through, the same journal she had started on the night the signal arrived. The void between stars is not empty, it breathes. She turned to the next page and wrote, "They thought our silence was weakness. They did not consider the third option, that we were quiet because we were busy. That we had decided, with the particular stubbornness of a species that has been underestimated since before it had language, to give them something worth hearing when we finally decided to speak. That when you classify something as dormant, you are not describing what it is. You are describing what you failed to look for. We were never dormant. We were listening. We were learning the shape of the thing we would eventually need to become. And when we became it, we did not announce it. We did not declare it. We demonstrated it in 6 minutes and 41 seconds, and then we put the weapons down and asked for a conversation, because we had always wanted the conversation. We had just needed them to be ready to have it as something other than conquerors talking to inventory. Now they were. So here we are, on a Tuesday, which is apparently when everything important happens." She closed the journal. Outside the facility, above the miles of rock and the old desert surface and the atmosphere and the vast dark between, the stars were shining again. They looked different now, not because they had changed, because humanity had, and the way you see something changes when you have stopped being afraid of it and started being responsible for your relationship with it, which is a harder thing than fear and a more interesting one. Mara Voss made a cup of coffee. It was, by the standards of the facility's kitchen, genuinely terrible. She drank it standing up, looking at the main screen where the final agreement text still glowed, and she thought, "We should have had better coffee for this." Then she thought, "We have time to work on the coffee." They had time for a great many things now.